Since 2009, HEC Paris and Dow Jones have teamed up to publish annual rankings of private equity firms based on the performance of their underlying funds. This ranking addresses the challenge of comparing returns for private equity at the fund manager level, where usually performance is otherwise recorded at the fund level, and overcomes a range of methodological challenges in order to provide such a ranking. First of all, one has to figure out what performance measure to look at to make this assessment. This is further complicated by private equity funds being raised over time and fund managers being on a different rhythm of fundraisers across times. Funds of different ages may be at different levels of their life, therefore suffering from the J-curve phenomenon. And finally, there's a question of overall data availability that would be required for such a ranking. I designed a 5-step methodology to address those issues by first and foremost focusing on those segments of private equity where data availability is greatest and where we have a relatively homogeneous set of funds, initially having started out with the large buyout segment and since then branching out into different methodologies. We filter on those homogeneous funds and then find a way to aggregate performance across funds raised in multiple vintages, always looking at a decade of activity. I always look at private equity funds old enough to be somewhat relevant in terms of performance, at least 4 years old. And I end the observation period with funds that are at least 13 years old because otherwise there's a risk of just capturing ancient history. Now within this vintage decade that moves every year naturally from different calendar years to different calendar years, we find underlying private equity funds of different age. And part of the methodology considers the relative maturity of those funds, the reliability of the performance measured at that point of their life as a weighting scheme. So you see it stylized here by measuring the level of correlation that I have empirically between a fund at a certain stage of its life and its ultimate performance. We can basically identify a weight that will give a more recent private equity fund, say just a 5-year-old fund, a lower weight than a fund that is 10, 9, or 11, or 12 years old, which basically has a fully reliable performance measure. So if we have different underlying funds from a variety of fund managers, the next question then becomes what performance measure to look at. Do I reason in terms of total value or cash-on-cash returns? Do I look at annual returns like an IRR or the aggregate multiple-based returns? And then do I look at returns in absolute terms or compared to the average of their vintage peer group? And if I go through those different elements, I could come up with 6 different performance measures for every given fund. And we could spend time figuring out which is the best of them. But rather than going down this path, I kind of apply a statistical technique called principal component analysis, which is commonly used in social sciences whenever an unobserved construct is being understood based on different proxies for this construct. The construct here, of course, is the performance of that private equity fund manager, and the proxies are those different performance measures. And the principal component analysis allows me to consider the common information that all those 6 measures carry and aggregate conveniently into one performance score. So technically, the ranking score of a given fund manager considers all the funds this fund manager has raised over the vintage decade of observation, weighted with the maturity of funds along those vintage decade, and then through the principal component analysis, considering a weighting of all those 6 performance measures to get to one aggregate performance score. It's very convenient to have just one score because we can actually rank fund managers. But for the non-statistician, the score is not obvious to interpret because this score is now neither an annualized IRR type measure nor a aggregate multiple-based measure, and can best be interpreted in statistical terms. So the measure, this performance score, is calibrated as having a score of 0 for the average fund, for the median fund to be specific, and then basically express the deviation from that median in multiples of standard deviation. What does this mean? If you imagine kind of a normal Gaussian distribution in the background, a standard deviation of 1 basically captures that you are, yes, 66% better than the rest of the pack. 2 standard deviations basically correspond to being better than 95% of the other private equity firms. So whenever you see the performance score in the ranking, you can interpret basically as how many standard deviations that fund manager is better than the average or the median fund in that population. And this performance score then gives us a very powerful measure to objectively rank GPs based on multiple funds and multiple performance measures. And every year we publish the best of the best because we want to put a spotlight onto the top performers in a given category, either the top 10 or top 20, depending on the sample size. And I often get the question, well, who's on the bottom of your distribution? We have this information, of course, but the contractual agreement with Dow Jones basically says that we only want to put a spotlight on the top performers, not harm anybody. Therefore, we will not disclose anybody outside that top or top 20 list.